The real estate listing had been too good to be true, and Sarah Chen should have known better. A Victorian mansion in the hills of Northern California for half the market price, complete with original hardwood floors, stained glass windows, and what the agent cheerfully described as loads of character. Loads of. The photos showed sun-drenched rooms with high ceilings and ornate moldings, but they couldn't capture the way the house seemed to watch her during that first walkthrough, or how the temperature dropped 10 degrees the moment she stepped through the front door. The agent, a nervous man named Bradley who kept checking his phone, had rushed through the tour with an urgency that should have raised red flags. He mentioned the previous owners had moved suddenly due to a family emergency, leaving behind most of their belongings, but his eyes never quite met hers when he said it. Sarah, fresh from a messy divorce and desperate for a new start, signed the papers that same afternoon. The house had been calling to her, she told herself, though she couldn't quite explain what she meant by that. Moving day came 3 weeks later, and as the movers carried her boxes up the wraparound porch, Sarah noticed how quiet the neighborhood was. Not peaceful quiet, but the kind of silence that feels pressed down, muffled, as if sound itself was being absorbed by something unseen. The other houses on Elm Street were well maintained but seemed empty, their windows dark even in broad daylight. Mrs. Patterson from next door introduced herself with a strained smile and a casserole, but when Sarah mentioned how excited she was about the house, the older woman's expression had shifted to something between pity and concern. "You be careful in there, dear," she had whispered, glancing at the Victorian's towering silhouette. Some houses remember things they shouldn't. Sarah had laughed it off as small-town superstition, but that first night, alone in the master bedroom with boxes stacked around her like cardboard sentinels, she heard them for the first time. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from somewhere deep within the house's bones. She told herself it was the old wood settling, the pipes adjusting to new usage, anything but what it actually sounded like. Someone walking with purpose through rooms she knew were empty. The footsteps came every night after that, always starting around midnight, always following the same path from what sounded like the basement up through the main floor, pausing at the bottom of the staircase before retreating back into silence. Sarah mapped the route during daylight hours, following what she imagined was the walker's path, but found nothing unusual. Just empty rooms filled with dust motes dancing in afternoon sunlight. The basement, when she finally worked up the courage to explore it, was disappointingly normal. Just concrete walls, a water heater, and the musty smell of years. But there was something about the far corner, where shadows seemed to gather more thickly, that made her hurry back upstairs. By the end of her first week, Sarah had grown accustomed to the nightly wanderings, even finding them oddly comforting, like having a predictable roommate who kept to themselves. The house began to feel less empty, as if she wasn't quite alone anymore. She started leaving lights on, not out of fear but courtesy, the way you might leave a porch light on for someone coming home late. The walking wasn't the only peculiarity. Doors she was certain she had closed would be found standing open, not wide but just ajar, as if someone had passed through and hadn't quite pulled them shut. The old radio in the kitchen would turn itself on at random hours, always tuned to static that occasionally resolved into fragments of voices speaking words she couldn't quite catch. The temperature in certain rooms would drop without warning, her breath misting in air that had been warm moments before. Sarah found herself talking to the house, apologizing when she bumped into furniture, saying good morning to empty hallways, as if the building itself was listening. The Victorian seemed to respond to her presence, settling more quietly when she was near, the mysterious footsteps growing softer, almost respectful. She began to think of her invisible companion as a guardian of sorts, someone who had been waiting for her arrival to feel at peace. The local librarian, a sharp-eyed woman named Helen who had lived in town for 60 years, was reluctant to discuss the house's history when Sarah stopped by during her second week. Helen's expression had tightened when Sarah mentioned her address, and she had glanced around the empty library before pulling out a manila folder from beneath the circulation desk. The newspaper clippings inside were yellowed and brittle, dating back 40 years to a tragedy that had shocked the small community. The Meridian family, parents and 3 children, had been found dead in their home at 1247 Elm Street, victims of what police had determined was a murder-suicide committed by the father, Thomas, during what neighbors described as a gradual descent into madness. The articles painted a picture of a man who had become obsessed with voices he claimed to hear in the walls, footsteps that followed him through the house, doors that opened on their own. In the weeks before the tragedy, Thomas had insisted that someone else was living in the house, someone the family couldn't see but who made their presence known through small disturbances and unexplained sounds. His wife, Margaret, had tried to get him help, but Thomas became increasingly paranoid, convinced that the invisible presence meant them harm. The final article, published a week after the bodies were discovered, mentioned that Thomas had left behind a journal filled with frantic entries about the walker in the walls and his desperate attempts to communicate with or appease this entity. The journal had been turned over to police and never released to the public. Helen had closed the folder gently, her weathered hands smoothing the cover. "The house has been sold 6 times since then," she said quietly. "Nobody stays long. Most folks start experiencing the same things Thomas wrote about in his journal. The walking, the doors, the feeling of being watched. Some handle it better than others." Sarah had driven home that afternoon with her mind racing, the newspaper clippings photocopied and folded in her purse. But strangely, the revelation didn't frighten her as much as it should have. If anything, it made her feel more connected to her invisible housemate, more understanding of what she was experiencing. Thomas Meridian had been driven to madness by the presence, but perhaps he had approached it wrong, with fear instead of acceptance. That night, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. Instead of lying in bed listening to the footsteps begin their nightly journey, she got up and followed them. The hardwood floors were cold against her bare feet as she made her way downstairs, guided by the sound of measured steps that seemed to stay just ahead of her. The walker led her through the living room, past the kitchen, down the basement stairs she had only briefly explored. In the corner where shadows gathered thickest, Sarah noticed something she had missed during her cursory daytime inspection. A section of the concrete wall that looked different, newer somehow, as if it had been patched and refinished. The footsteps stopped directly in front of this wall, and Sarah found herself standing in a silence so complete it seemed to have weight. She pressed her palm against the cool concrete and whispered, "I'm here. I'm listening." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Images flooded her mind, not seen, but experienced, as if someone else's memories were being downloaded directly into her consciousness. She saw the basement as it had been 40 years ago, saw Thomas Meridian's increasingly frantic attempts to wall up something that terrified him, saw him mixing concrete in a wheelbarrow while his family slept upstairs, unaware that their father was sealing away what he believed was the source of their haunting. But the memories went deeper, further back, to a time before the Victorian was built, when the land had been home to something else entirely. Sarah saw glimpses of an older house, smaller and cruder, where a different family had lived and died under circumstances that had been buried along with the foundations. She saw layer upon layer of tragedy and secrecy, each building upon the last, creating a palimpsest of horror that stretched back generations. The walker wasn't one presence but many, souls trapped not by the house itself, but by the refusal of the living to acknowledge what had happened within its walls. As the visions faded, Sarah understood why the footsteps had grown gentler since her arrival, why the house felt less hostile with each passing day. The previous inhabitants had all tried to fight or flee from the presence, but Sarah had done something different. She had accepted it, had begun to treat the walker as a fellow resident rather than an intruder. This acceptance had created a bridge between the living and the dead, allowing communication where before there had been only fear and misunderstanding. Over the following weeks, Sarah's relationship with the walker deepened and evolved. She learned to interpret the opening and closing of doors as a form of communication, understood that the radio static was an attempt to speak using frequencies that existed between worlds. She began leaving out offerings of sorts, a cup of tea that would be found empty the next morning, books left open to pages that would be turned by invisible hands, photographs from her own life arranged on surfaces where they could be examined by curious, unseen eyes. The walker seemed particularly fascinated by images of Sarah's daughter Emma, a college student who lived across the country and planned to visit for Thanksgiving. Sarah would find these photographs moved to different locations throughout the house, always treated with careful reverence, as if the walker was trying to understand this connection between mother and child that had been so violently severed in its own existence. The revelation of the walker's identity came gradually, pieced together through dream visions and subtle environmental cues. The presence was Margaret Meridian, Thomas's wife, who had died not by her husband's hand as the newspapers reported, but as a result of his attempt to seal away what he perceived as evil. Margaret had been in the basement that night, trying to stop Thomas from his frantic wall building when a structural beam weakened by his excavations had collapsed. Thomas, already deep in madness, had convinced himself that Margaret's death was proof of the malevolent nature of the presence, and in his guilt and terror, he had completed the wall, sealing his wife's body inside before taking the lives of his children and himself in a final act of desperate madness. Margaret had been trying to protect her family from Thomas's growing instability, not from any supernatural threat, but her death had trapped her spirit in the very place where her husband had tried to bury the truth. For 40 years, she had walked the same path through the house searching for her children, calling out to residents who fled rather than listened, growing more desperate and isolated with each family that abandoned the Victorian. Sarah's acceptance had broken through decades of loneliness and misunderstanding, finally giving Margaret a chance to be heard and acknowledged. The weeks leading up to Emma's Thanksgiving visit were filled with anticipation from both Sarah and her invisible companion. Margaret's presence became more pronounced, more clearly defined, as if the prospect of meeting Sarah's daughter was giving her strength and focus. Sarah could sometimes catch glimpses of her in peripheral vision, a tall woman in a faded dress moving through rooms with graceful purpose, and the temperature changes became less shocking, more like the comfortable coolness of shared space. Sarah prepared for her daughter's visit with unusual care, cleaning the house more thoroughly than necessary, arranging flowers in vases throughout the rooms, cooking enough food for far more than 2 people. She found herself setting 3 places at the dinner table, though she couldn't have explained why to anyone who asked. Margaret seemed to approve of these preparations, her footsteps taking on a lighter quality, almost eager, and Sarah sometimes heard what sounded like humming coming from empty rooms, melodies from another era sung in a voice like distant wind. Emma arrived on a gray November morning, her rental car crunching over fallen leaves as Sarah watched from the front window. Margaret's presence a warm sensation at her shoulder. Sarah's daughter was a practical young woman studying engineering, skeptical of anything that couldn't be measured or quantified, but as she stepped through the front door, her expression changed to one of curious alertness. "This place feels occupied," Emma said, setting down her suitcase and looking around the foyer with the kind of attention usually reserved for technical problems. "Like there's more going on here than just empty rooms." Sarah smiled, pleased that her daughter's sensitivity might make the introductions easier. Over the next few hours, as they caught up over coffee and toured the house, Emma began to notice the same phenomena that had become routine for Sarah: doors standing slightly ajar, temperature fluctuations, the sense of being observed by benevolent eyes. But rather than fear, Emma displayed the same curiosity that had made her a successful engineering student, asking questions about patterns and frequencies, treating the supernatural occurrences like an interesting puzzle to be solved. That evening, as they prepared dinner together, Emma paused in her chopping of vegetables and tilted her head, listening. "Mom, do you hear that? It sounds like someone humming in the dining room." Sarah listened too and smiled, recognizing Margaret's melody. "Why don't you go introduce yourself?" she suggested gently. "I think she's been looking forward to meeting you." Emma raised an eyebrow but didn't question her mother's certainty about the presence's gender or intentions. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and walked into the dining room, Sarah following quietly behind. The air in the room was noticeably cooler, and the humming grew clearer, a lullaby that seemed to wrap around them like an embrace. Emma stood in the center of the room and spoke into the apparent emptiness. "Hello, I'm Emma, Sarah's daughter. Thank you for taking care of my mom." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Every candle in the room flickered simultaneously. The chandelier chimed softly as if touched by invisible fingers, and for just a moment, both women could see her clearly. Margaret Meridian, tall and graceful, with kind eyes and graying hair, wearing a blue dress that seemed to be made of twilight itself. She was reaching out toward Emma with an expression of such longing and joy that Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. Margaret had been a mother too, and the chance to interact with someone else's beloved daughter was healing something in her that had been broken for 4 decades. The 3 women spent the evening together in a way that transcended the boundaries between life and death. Margaret couldn't speak in words they could hear, but her communication was clear through the movement of objects, the arrangement of photographs, the way she guided them to discover things throughout the house that told her story more completely than any verbal explanation could have managed. She showed them her own children's belongings, preserved in a cedar chest that had been hidden behind false walls, revealed love letters she had written to Thomas before his mind began to fracture, shared through spiritual osmosis the depth of her love for her family and the tragedy of their loss. Emma, with her engineer's mind, began to understand Margaret's situation as a problem of energy and communication, theorizing that strong emotional connections could create pathways between different states of existence. She suggested that Margaret's presence had become more defined and powerful because Sarah had provided the acceptance and companionship that allowed her to focus her energy more effectively. "She's not haunting the house," Emma explained to her mother as they sat in the living room, Margaret's presence a comforting coolness between them on the sofa. She's been trying to heal from trauma, just like any living person would, but she's been doing it alone for 40 years, which would drive anyone to desperation. The Thanksgiving dinner they shared the next day was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. She and Emma cooked together while Margaret's presence moved through the kitchen, occasionally shifting a spoon or adjusting the temperature on the stove, with the familiarity of someone who had once been the heart of domestic life in the house. They set 3 places at the table, leaving the 3rd chair empty but somehow not vacant, and as they said grace, Sarah included thanks for their unusual companion who had made the house feel like home in ways she was only beginning to understand. After dinner, as they sat around the table sharing stories and memories, Margaret began to manifest more clearly than she ever had before. She appeared not as a frightening specter, but as a woman finally at peace, her form becoming solid enough to cast shadows, her presence warm and nurturing. She listened to Emma's stories about college with the attention of a grandmother, hearing about her grandchild's achievements, and when Sarah spoke about her divorce and her fears about starting over, Margaret's hand, translucent but unmistakably real, reached across the table to squeeze her fingers in comfort. But as the evening wore on, Sarah began to notice changes in Margaret's appearance that filled her with growing unease. The spirit's form was becoming more solid, more present, but there was something desperate in her increasing manifestation, as if she was pouring all of her energy into this single night of connection. Margaret's eyes, which had been kind and peaceful, began to show signs of an ancient hunger, a need that went deeper than simple companionship. Emma noticed the shift too, her engineering mind recognizing patterns that didn't fit with her theories about spiritual energy and communication. Margaret's manifestations throughout the evening had been growing stronger, but they had also been drawing energy from somewhere, and that somewhere appeared to be the living women sharing her space. Sarah felt a growing fatigue that went beyond normal tiredness, a sense that something essential was being slowly drained from her, and Emma's usually bright complexion had taken on a pale, drawn quality that spoke of more than just late-night conversation. As midnight approached, Margaret's form became fully solid, no longer translucent but as real and present as any living person. She could touch objects without them moving mysteriously, could speak in words they could hear, could embrace them with arms that felt warm and substantial. But her eyes had changed completely, no longer kind but filled with a possessive intensity that made Sarah's blood run cold. "I've been so lonely," Margaret said, her voice beautiful but somehow wrong, like music played in a minor key. 40 years without my children, without my family, but now I have you, Sarah, and your beautiful daughter. We can be together forever, the 3 of us, in this house where love never has to end." Sarah tried to stand but found her limbs heavy, unresponsive, as if her very life force was being slowly absorbed by the woman across from her. Emma was in a similar state, her sharp mind clearly recognizing the danger but her body no longer obeying her commands to move or flee. Margaret had not been a benevolent spirit sharing space with the living. She had been a hungry ghost, feeding slowly on Sarah's acceptance and kindness, growing stronger with each act of welcome until she had enough power to trap them in the same state of existence that had held her for 4 decades. The newspapers had been wrong about Thomas Meridian's madness, but not in the way Sarah had assumed. Thomas had not been driven insane by supernatural harassment. He had been desperately trying to protect his family from a wife who had died, and returned as something that was no longer quite Margaret, something that loved so possessively it would destroy rather than lose what it claimed to cherish. The wall in the basement had not been built to contain Margaret's body, but to contain Margaret herself. After Thomas realized that death had not ended her need for her family, but had twisted it into something monstrous, Thomas had sealed the wall not in madness, but in a final act of protection, knowing that his wife's love had become a prison that would trap their children's souls, along with their bodies. He had killed them quickly, mercifully, before Margaret could claim them and then taken his own life rather than exist as her eternal captive. But 40 years later, Margaret had finally found what she had been searching for, a new family to love and keep forever, whether they wanted to be kept or not. Sarah felt her consciousness beginning to fade as Margaret's hand pressed against her cheek with terrible tenderness, the touch that had once comforted now drawing away everything that made her herself. Emma was slumping in her chair, her brilliant mind dimming as it was absorbed into something larger and hungrier and infinitely more lonely. "We'll be so happy together," Margaret whispered, and her voice was the sound of doors closing, of paths ending, of choices being taken away forever. "I'll take such good care of you both. You'll never have to leave, never have to be alone, never have to grow old or sick or tired. We'll have eternity to be a family." As the last of her strength faded, Sarah understood with horrible clarity that Mrs. Patterson's warning had been exactly right. Some houses do remember things they shouldn't, and sometimes what they remember is how to love so completely that it becomes indistinguishable from death. The house on Elm Street would go back on the market within a month, listed once again at a price too good to be true, waiting for the next family to be drawn by its character and charm. The realtor would be a different nervous man who couldn't quite meet potential buyers' eyes, and the previous owners would have left suddenly due to a family emergency, leaving behind most of their belongings and no forwarding address. Three-place settings would remain on the dining room table as if dinner had been interrupted, and sometimes prospective buyers would comment on the feeling that the house was occupied, that there was more going on in those sun-drenched rooms than empty space. But the footsteps that walked through the house at midnight were no longer solitary, and the voices that whispered through the radio static spoke in harmonies of three, and in the basement behind the concrete wall, a family was finally together forever, just as they had always wanted to be.